Welcome to Doctorates of the Absurd, your provider of belief on demand.
Today, we are doing a deep dive that's a little different. We're looking at history, yes, but less as a series of events and more as a kind of philosophical warning.
Warning, I like that. So where are we honing in on?
We're focusing on the Levant and the ancient Mediterranean. But the real subject here is the birth of these massive artificial social structures. Our source material has the fantastic term for them, Leviathans.
The Leviathan, the great beast.
Exactly. And we're going to be tracking the very real and often hidden human cost that comes with creating them.
It sounds incredibly intense. And just looking at the sources, they really pull no punches. It feels less like a history lesson and more like an autopsy, a philosophical autopsy.
It's a great way to put it. We're going to trace the path of the early Israelites. We'll look at the strange death of the Hittite Empire, the rise of what's called the Phoenician commercial octopus.
That's an image?
It is. And we'll finish with the Greek descent into what the poet Hesiod called the Age of Iron.
So for you, listening right now, the mission of this deep dive is to try and scratch a very specific and I think very persistent existential itch.
A problem that just doesn't seem to go away.
Right. It's this. Why do societies, when they get this incredibly rare chance for a fresh start, a meaningful new beginning, why do they so quickly abandon what makes them original?
I mean, the Exodus is the classic example, right? You're freed from this huge Egyptian state machine. You have every reason to build something new.
And instead, you conform. You end up building a system that looks suspiciously like the one you just fled.
It is the ultimate societal tragedy, isn't it? You get your freedom, you have this blank slate, and what do? You build a smaller, maybe a bit shoddier, but structurally identical prison.
So the conflict we're watching, the core binary for this entire deep dive, is this collision between two fundamental forces.
On one side, you have the free original community, and on the other, you have the artificial consuming state, the Leviathan.
And our story begins with a pretty shocking defeat for the free community right out of the gate.
A shocking defeat. It starts with the people who, on paper, were probably the best equipped, both intellectually and spiritually, to create something completely different. It's a true tragedy of conformity.
Okay, let's jump right into that. Let's start with the Israelites. They've just left Egypt. They have this radical new idea, an abstract, transcendental God.
Moses's innovative theories, as the source puts it. And logically, you're right. That should have been the foundation for a radically different kind of society, a different political architecture.
It seems like it would have to be. I mean, if your God isn't tied to a specific place or a statue in a temple, your whole society should reflect that, shouldn't it?
It absolutely should have. The philosophical groundwork was all there. Their guiding concept was that sovereignty, ultimate power, didn't rest in a king on a throne. It rested in this abstract, all-powerful Yahweh.
A concept that, in theory, should just dismantle the old ways of doing things, the tribal loyalties, the territorial squabbles that define the whole region.
It should have. But the sources we're looking at are, they're pretty brutal in their assessment of what actually happened.
So what was the reality on the ground?
The reality was, well, they did just nothing new.
Nothing at all.
Nothing at all. I mean, the moment they arrive in Canaan, what do? They immediately occupy the fields and the lodges of the Canaanites. They just expropriated. They slot themselves right into pre-existing structures.
So all of Moses's innovative laws, this whole unique framework.
It was just sort of layered precariously on top of a social and economic system that was already there. A system that was, if not fully Leviathanic, then at least proto-Leviathanic. It was primed for it.
How long did they even try to hold on to that original vision, that tension between the new laws and the old structures?
Not long. According to the analysis, you're looking at maybe 2 or 3 generations of even attempting to maintain that distinct identity.
That's a very short window.
A tiny window. This attempt at purity, sticking to the rules of their dead leader, it just gave way really quickly. The sheer practical difficulty of trying to live by this abstract non-territorial law while you're living in a concrete, settled village, it was too much. So they just started copying the customs of their unclean neighbors.
And this confusion, this sort of societal breakdown, it actually manifested in physical ways, didn't it? The source mentions this oratorical frenzy.
Yes. It notes that things like public outbursts, fits, even trances were common during this period. People were just desperate for direction. It was this chaotic, messy, internal debate, kind of communal crisis.
It sounds
It
terrifying.
probably was, but our sources make a really interesting point here. They suggest that compared to what they call the controlled communication cages of modern society,
The what?
controlled communication cages, think of our media landscape, how managed it is. Compared to that, these ancient Leviathans and these moments of messy creation actually offered a kind of a chaotic freedom. There was a genuine space for public debate about what the state should even be.
Even if the debate was just about which form of oppression to choose next.
Precisely. That's the crucial observation. Even when they were debating, the only options they could really imagine were just copies of their neighbors.
So what were the two models they were looking at?
The choice really boiled down to the two big local powers. On one hand, you had the Phoenicians. So the question was, should we chase their good things? You know, their incredible commercial wealth, all the luxury goods.
Wealth versus might.
Exactly. Or, option two, do we go for the Philistine model, their iron weapons and military efficiency? True, centralized military power. It was the age-old tension. Commercial power or military force.
And what forced their hand?
The sudden, brutal realization of their own weakness, their own political irrelevance.
I hope so.
Well, the pressure just ratchets up when a prophet, an orator, stands up and points out the hard truth. He says, look, we only have the concept of a king of kings. It's a beautiful idea, this abstract divine power. But the actual power in the world, the military reality,
That belongs to someone else.
it belongs to the Assyrians, to Ashurabi II. They realized they had to make their concept real. They had to give their god a body, so to speak. And that body was a state, a Leviathan that could actually compete on that stage.
And that realization is the catalyst. It directly leads to the creation of the militarized Leviathan under Saul.
Saul accepts the challenge.
Mhm.
He tries a wholesale imitation of the Assyrian model. He levies troops. He centralizes command. But it's a disaster.
Why?
He's killed.
Yeah.
He tests his new army against the Philistines, these highly organized Iron Men, and his forces just collapse. The source implies that Saul was just using the tools, you know, the army, the taxes, without really understanding the deep mechanics of the state machine.
Which, of course, clears the path for David, the man who really understands the machine.
David is the pragmatic one. He's the genius of the system. He understood that a functional Leviathan isn't just about having an army. It's about specialization, dedication. So he completely overhauls the Israelite structure.
What does he do?
He takes the sons of Levi, who might have been the last remnants of that old priestly class, and he transforms them. They become, and this is a quote, efficient killing machines deployed in a permanent army.
Wow. From priests to killers.
A total reconditioning.
Yeah.
And then he supplements this new professional army with skilled iron mercenaries. He adopts the very technology and the very methods that got Saul killed.
He didn't just imitate the model, he perfected it.
He optimized it. And David immediately delivers on the military dream. He achieves, through force, what the pure concept of Yahweh had not: territorial conquest. He conquers Moab, Ammon, Edom, Aram.
And what about the Philistines, the giants?
That's the fascinating part. When David finally turns his new machine on them, he defeats them easily, which reveals they were not giants at all. The source implies that the real power was never the Philistines' inherent strength. It was the idea of a centralized, permanent, war-ready machine, an idea that David had now mastered.
So the military machine is a success. That immediately creates the need for the next step in building a state, right? The sacralization of the state.
Exactly. You can't run a kingdom on military force alone. You need a story, a legitimizing ideology. So David, prompted by an orator, does what everyone else in the region does. He emulates the Baal worshippers by building a great temple for Yahweh. But this act, this is the conceptual climax of the whole tragedy.
Okay, let's use our concept decoder on this one because it's a big idea. The source claims that the King of Kings, this new temple god, is not some pre-Leviathanic relic. It is, and I'm quoting, the abstraction of Leviathan itself. Break that down for us. What does that actually mean?
It means the god's job description changed completely. A pre-Leviathanic god, a relic, would be a tribal spirit, maybe a god of a specific mountain or a guardian of a particular family line.
Right. Small scale. Local.
Very local.
Yeah.
But the King of Kings, this is a god whose primary purpose is to justify centralized power, to justify military expansion, to justify the extraction of resources from the population. The source is blunt. This new god is treated exactly like the gods of the ziggurats, like Marduk, Ashur, Baal. They're all just abstract projections of the state's own power.
So the temple isn't a place of original worship. It's the new corporate headquarters for the state philosophy. They're basically worshiping the perfected idea of absolute monarchy.
Yes, the political and economic function of this new religion was identical to what was happening in Babylon or Assyria. And under David's son Solomon, this just becomes blatant. Powerful men start filling their houses with good things, all in the God's name. They rationalize their own wealth through this state-sanctioned religion.
And the culture itself gets plagiarized.
Total seamless conformity. The stories become Sumero-Akkadian. The proverbs are Egyptian. The law itself is fundamentally Babylonian. The imitation is complete.
So, given that they started with such a unique foundation, was there any real resistance to all this massive cultural theft?
There were flickers of it, brief but powerful. You have the order Elisha, who just rages against this lack of originality, this constant copying of their neighbors, especially when they had what the source calls an unusual god.
So what did he try to do?
He actually tried to launch a second exodus, a call to return to the purity of the wandering tribal life, to abandon the state. But he fails. Once the state machine is built and the wealth is consolidated, that window for originality, it's already slammed shut.
And the final philosophical surrender, the justification for this new order, seems to arrive with the Book of Job. This is a really profound point we should probably spend a moment on.
It is. The analysis we're drawing from, which cites Stanley Diamond, interprets the Book of Job as this incredibly sophisticated apology for accepting wealth, specifically personal wealth in a sea of poverty.
An apology.
Yes, an apology in the sense of a defense. It's a defense of wealth as a divine reward for blind submission to an inscrutable, unchallengeable God.
Let's slow down on that because that's a huge idea. For anyone listening, Job is the good man who loses everything, questions God, and then gets his wealth back twofold. So where's the tension? Why does the source call this an early era of smugness?
The tension is sociopolitical. In the older pre-Leviathanic tribal world, if you accumulated a huge amount of wealth, it was seen as suspicious. The communal ethic demanded you redistribute it immediately. Job is uncomfortable with his new, immense riches. It feels wrong to him. It goes against the older, more egalitarian way of life.
But the book resolves that tension for him.
It resolves it by reframing the wealth. It's not a social problem. It's a reward. It's a reward for his submission, for not questioning the divine structure, which has now become interchangeable with the state structure. This is the crucial leap. Wealth is no longer a communal responsibility. It's a sign of individual grace, granted by the King of Kings.
And that rationalization that God specifically wants you to be rich while others are poor, that's the origin of that smugness.
That's the seed. That complacency means that when the final warning comes from the egalitarian shepherd Amos, who rails against the injustice and the luxury of the ruling class, it's just too late.
The writing is on the wall.
Completely. And the consequence of conformity is, well, it's extinction. Because they chose to imitate, they made themselves a player on the world stage. They became a visible target. But they'd also inherited all the internal weaknesses of the Leviathan model.
And a bigger Leviathan was coming.
A much bigger one. The Assyrian war engine, reconditioned under kings like Tiglath-Pileser III and Sargon II, it was hungry. It needed resources. And it just swallows the two bickering Israelite kingdoms, Israel and Judah, and deports their populations.
And here's the real sting, the final irony. The source points out that the forging of something new, a renewed sense of solidarity, a focus on scripture, the memory of the Messiah, all of that only happens during their long captivity.
Yes, during the diaspora.
Yeah.
Not when they had their own land in their own state. And we have to really emphasize this point. The source debunks the standard excuse for this failure.
The excuse being?
We had to conform because we were surrounded by enemies. It's the excuse Lenin's heirs will use later, the encirclement argument.
Right. We can't afford originality because we're under threat.
But the source makes a very strong case that this just wasn't true for them. The Israelites were largely left alone by the major powers for 10 to 20 generations.
10 to 20 generations.
It's a staggering amount of time. 3, 4, maybe 500 years. They had the time, they had the space, they had the intellectual framework for genuine innovation. But they consciously chose the easier, well-trodden path of conformity.
So the story of Israel is this cautionary tale of how a Leviathan is born through imitation. Now I need to turn to the second big question in the source material, how these giants die. And the first example is incredible, the death of the Hittite giant.
The specter of the Hittites is so powerful precisely because they were so completely erased. This was a colossal empire. This was the great rival of Egypt at the Battle of Kadesh. A civilization defined by its complex treaties, its laws, its military.
A true giant of its time.
A true giant. And yet the sources tell us it just completely decomposes. It drops out of the historical picture so thoroughly that the later classical Greeks who lived just next door, they didn't even remember its name.
Which is just mind-boggling. And the mechanism of its decay is what makes this so relevant for us now. It wasn't some sudden external event, no massive invasion, no biblical drought, no cataclysmic earthquake.
The cause of death was purely internal. And we have contemporary witnesses. The Egyptian scribes, who were watching Kati, their name for the Hittite lands collapse, they wrote something very simple.
What did they say?
No one stood up for Kati.
No one stood up for Kati.
Wow, the source translates this beautifully. It says the immortals, meaning the states, the Leviathans, they die when their human contents withdraw and let the carcasses rot. The artificial worm, the structure, it has no life of its own.
So the collapse wasn't a single violent event. It was just the end result of centuries of quiet individual acts of resignation, of people just walking away.
Exactly. The Leviathan is a machine that runs on compliance and mobilized labor. The Hittite state demanded enormous amounts of tribute, constant military conscription. It just exhausted its population. And at some point, the subjects must have realized that complying offered them no more benefit than resisting.
So they didn't start a revolution, they just stopped.
They just stopped. They withdrew their labor, their allegiance, their bodies. The massive state structure was evacuated from the inside out. It left this huge, hollow corpse for other people to find later.
That is a staggering insight. The entire apparatus, the army, the bureaucracy, the roads, it all runs on the belief of the people inside the machine. When the belief dies, the machine just stops working.
And in the vacuum that's left behind, you see this amazing phenomenon the source calls recovered freedom. In the lands the Hittites used to control, local communities they reemerged.
What do they look like?
We read about dancers forming circles around Subal, the old earth goddess, celebrating their freedom from the abstract state god. And crucially, the text notes these were free people ruled by queens.
Queens, not kings.
Right, which means their governance was likely localized, maybe even matriarchal, and it was definitely not run by formal archons or kings in the Leviathanic sense.
And was this model sustainable, or just a brief interlude?
It was highly sustainable. The source notes that these communities were still there, still dancing, still organized this way 10 or 15 generations later. This is the counter-narrative, the non-centralized, self-governing community that can just quietly persist for centuries.
But the collapse, even though it brings freedom, it leaves behind scars, these unhealing wounds from the old war machine that don't just go away.
Those are the remnants, the iron-armed Mycenaean and Ionian bands. These are the former soldiers, the professional killers, the segments of the Hittite worm that didn't fully rot.
The unemployed warriors.
Exactly. They're professional soldiers with no war to fight and no state to pay them. So they become, as the text puts it, pests on the outskirts of peaceful villages, just waiting for a new Leviathan to come along and recruit them. They're not a new society. They are the lingering military trauma of the old one.
Now, the Egyptian Leviathan offers a different path to death, but one that's just as fatal. It doesn't decompose, it freezes.
And this is the death of all creativity, all political and intellectual life. The Egyptian giant was so old, so rigid, that it managed to survive, but only by achieving a state of complete internal paralysis.
What was causing that paralysis?
Crippling internal pressures. The source points to a few key things. The state was constantly having to buy off striking labor gangs. It had to negotiate with provinces that had defected just to keep them in the empire's orbit. And it had to keep promoting potential conspirators into positions of power just to stop them from launching a rebellion.
So all the state's energy and money was going into just maintenance, suppressing internal threats.
All of it. Every resource, all the intellectual energy, all state policy was just devoted to stability. So they stopped doing anything the predecessors hadn't already done. Innovation, expansion, even significant reform, all of that became an existential threat to this incredibly fragile system.
They became completely obsessed with the past.
That's the result. This completely conservative posture where the only goal is to show proper respect to the dead gods and to preserve what little still remains of a long-dead past. The Leviathan is still standing, but it's petrified. It's an immobile, irrelevant structure in a world that's changing all around it.
And while the big Assyrian giant has been quiet during this period, it's about to wake up. But first, we have to turn to the pygmies who take over the stage in this quiet interim, the Phoenicians. And their influence is going to be enormous.
So now we shift our focus. We've been talking about military power, political structures. Now we turn to pure economic predation. The Phoenicians, working out of their city-states like Tyre and Sidon, they perfected the commercial Leviathan. They weren't conquerors. They were seaborne merchants, master logisticians, traders.
And their identity was built around one thing, their monopoly on purple dye.
Absolutely. They were known as the Red Men, or Purple Men, because they had a complete global monopoly on Tyrian purple. This dye was extracted from the murex snail. It was incredibly difficult and costly to produce, and they guarded the secret fiercely.
So the purple garments they made were.
They were as precious as, and this is the quote, gold and uranium will be in later ages. They controlled the entire high-end luxury goods market of the ancient world. And that gave them just a massive amount of leverage.
And the sources draw a very direct and frankly very uncomfortable line between this new commercial power and the Israelite Leviathan we were just talking about.
The connection is intimate, and it's exploitative. The sons of Levi, the new ruling class in Israel, became extremely close with their Phoenician neighbors. They were intermarrying, adopting their commercial practices, even worshiping Baal, the Phoenician god of wealth.
And the source suggests this is why Israel never developed anything original. They were too close to this dominant economic power.
That's the argument. This deep structural closeness is what cemented their lack of originality. They were already part of someone else's economic system.
Which brings us to this idea of economic colonization. The Israelites weren't just culturally influenced, they were basically an economic colony.
Precisely. Later prejudices might paint the Jews as merchants, but from King David's time on, the reality was that the masses were farmers. They were peasants. They were the friendly hinterland for the rapacious Phoenicians.
And that meant their labor was brutally heavy.
Unbelievably heavy. They were planters and reapers. And they had to hand over a huge chunk of their harvest every year, their cattle, their grain, their oil, just to pay for Phoenician imports, the purple cloth, the fancy trinkets, and, crucially, the iron tools they needed for farming.
And the consequence of that overwhelming labor, the source calls it the curse of labor.
Yes, they had neither the time nor the energy to be original. Their entire lives were defined by the physical work required to satisfy the demands of this trade network. The whole secret of the Phoenician model was pure commercial leverage.
How so?
They gave things that cost them very little trinkets, which have a high value but weigh almost nothing. And in return, they took things that cost the farmers everything. Grain, cattle, things that represent a year of backbreaking, time-consuming work. This meant their ships could sail with only the lightest, most valuable goods, maximizing profit over huge distances.
And this is where the Phoenician model becomes a truly unique kind of villain in our story, in its devastating impact on the natural world. This is the birth of what the source calls the Western spirit against the wilderness.
The birth of the idea that the world is just an infinite resource to be exploited for profit. The source is shockingly clear on this point. It describes the commercial worm as a greater rapist of the biosphere than all the earlier Leviathans combined.
A greater rapist than the huge military empires. Why?
Because the old Leviathans, like Egypt or Assyria, were territorial. Their extraction was mostly localized, used to feed their army in their capital city. The Phoenician model was completely different. Their goal was to find things that were abundant in one place, ship them to a place where they were rare, and keep doing it until the source was gone.
Until it was completely depleted.
And then they just moved on to the next resource, the next forest, the next coastline.
It's really jarring to read the specific examples of this, especially in Levant. An area we think of today as being quite dry and sparse.
It completely changes your perception of that landscape. The text notes that before Solomon of Israel and Hiram of Tyre started their joint ventures, the Levant was teeming with trees and elephants.
Elephants in the Levant.
Yes. But within a single generation, the landscape was changed forever. The great forests of cedar were gone. They were in the hulls of ships and the walls of temples. The elephants were hunted to extinction, which forced Phoenician traders to start sailing across the Red Sea to get tusks from Indian elephant killers. They were actively reshuffling, and the quote is, murdered fauna and flora on a global scale.
This octopus-like structure with its ships and its trading posts, it was the world's first truly globalized commercial empire.
It was. The network of tentacles reached out and embraced most of the shorelines of the known world. They set up key trading hubs like Gadir, which is now Cadiz in Spain, Carthage in North Africa, posts all over Sicily. And here's the insidious part, the mechanism that ensures the Leviathan keeps spreading.
What's that?
These new trading posts, they immediately grew into new octopus-like monsters themselves.
They became new centers of extraction.
Exactly. They didn't just facilitate trade back to the homeland, they immediately started plundering their own new hinterlands. The Iberian Peninsula, the interior of North Africa, all of it was strip-mined to supply the endless demand of the great motherships.
And the result of this?
The source says that Western Eurasia became a thick web of interlocking tentacles, a place where a free human being can neither jump nor stand nor sit.
That's a powerful description. It's a world where an independent, non-commercial life is becoming physically impossible, which sets the stage perfectly for the entry and the eventual corruption of the Greeks.
To really get the Greek story, we have to kind of throw out the standard narrative of a rise into civilization. The source frames it completely differently. It's a reaction, and ultimately it's a fall.
A reaction to what?
To the existence of the earlier Leviathans. Their presence on the steppes pushed other peoples, the ancestors of the Mitanni, the Kassites, the Hittites themselves, who either fled or braced for a fight.
But when they did fight, they usually ended up getting caught in a leviathanic net of their own, just like we saw with Israel.
Precisely. So now we look at the groups that descended into Greece and Anatolia. The Mycenaeans, the Ionians, the Dorians. They were on the move specifically because of the Hittite Leviathan. They were fleeing its conscript hunts and its tribute raids. They weren't looking for civilization. They were running from a predator, and they brought with them a fiercely anti-state culture.
They were, at their core, warrior tribes.
Yes, and at first, they were very successful. These newcomers, who were linguistic cousins of the Hittites they were fleeing, swept away the last of the Mycenaean strongholds after the Hittite Empire fell apart. They formed these tight tribal leagues, led by a basileus.
And a basileus is not a king in the way we think of it.
No, not at all. It translates more like a war chief, maybe a one-time priest, but crucially, not a permanent divine monarch with a bureaucracy and a tax system.
This group is what the poet Hesiod would later call the brazen race.
The brazen race. This is the embodiment of the anti-Leviathanic warrior federation. And their initial goal was to destroy every single trace of what their own descendants would later call civilization.
They physically rejected it.
Actively and physically. They razed the fortresses, they flattened the palaces, and they destroyed writings. They would actually take old Hittite clay tablets and just use them as building materials, like stones in their new walls. Their identity was fierce. Their spears are their gods, and they lived for battle. They were terrible and strong, and this is a key detail, they ate no bread.
Meaning they rejected settled agriculture.
They rejected the entire extractive settled model. So you have this culture that is defined by its rejection of the state. So the question becomes, how did the Phoenician octopus manage to corrupt a society that was so militarily strong and so philosophically opposed to everything it represented?
It wasn't with an army.
No, it was with commerce. It was seduction, not force. The corruption starts when those big ships come in and unload their goods.
Yeah.
The purple cloth, the ivory, the fine metalwork. And the heroes, the warrior chiefs, they feel compelled by custom and status to regale the strangers with gifts in return.
And that simple act of exchange changes everything.
It shifts the entire focus of the warrior class. Suddenly, the goal isn't just raiding your enemies for glory. It's about acquiring commodities you can trade. It's about maintaining your status through gift-giving.
So victory on the battlefield becomes less important than having something to trade for a bolt of purple cloth.
It creates a domestic demand for wealth. The warriors quickly realize that the women in the neighboring villages, the ones squeezing oil from olives and juice from grapes, they are the key. They produce the things the Phoenicians want.
So the warriors stop raiding them.
And they start protecting them. They post guards at the local shrines and dance grounds, not out of piety, but to ensure stability, to protect the flow of commodities.
The warrior ethos gets completely co-opted. They're not warriors anymore. They're running a protection racket.
They morph from warriors into proto-tax collectors. There's the security detail for the local export economy. And the text notes, with some irony, that the grandsons of Agamemnon, the legendary war chief, they soon show up on the Aegean shores as merchants of wine and olive oil.
The heroes become merchants.
One village after another becomes a functional tentacle of the Phoenician octopus. And in the process, they even learn the Phoenician alphabet, the very kind of writing their ancestors had destroyed.
So the Greek rise into the classical age is actually framed here as a descent into commercial servitude. Their whole warrior philosophy was just repurposed to serve this foreign commercial beast.
And this integration into the commercial web is already complete when the story takes its next turn.
Uh,
The Assyrian worm finally rises again and swallows the Phoenician head of the octopus. This leaves the Greek tentacles on their own, but they've been fully indoctrinated into the commercial model. It sets the stage for their own city-state mercantilism to emerge.
okay, so we've tracked this path. We've seen Israel's imitation game, the Hittites' internal rot, the Greeks' commercial surrender, and all of these paths seem to lead to the same destination, what Hesiod calls the Age of Iron. The sources frame the high stakes here, what's really lost, as two essential social virtues, eidos and nemesis.
And this conceptual loss is really the core philosophical takeaway of the whole deep dive. We should probably define those terms clearly for everyone listening.
Yes, let's do that. What exactly are eidos and nemesis?
Eidos is the internal guardrail. You can think of it as shame or respect or conscience. It's that feeling of restraint that stops a person from acting unjustly, even if they know they could get away with it. It's self-regulation.
And nemesis?
Nemesis is the external guardrail. It's righteous indignation. It's the fear of justifiable public anger and retribution. So if eidos keeps the individual in check from the inside, nemesis keeps the community balanced from the outside.
And to surrender to the Age of Iron means you lose both at the same time. You lose your internal conscience and you lose external accountability.
Precisely. And it's at this exact moment, this moment of moral decay and commercial integration, just as the memory of their Brazen Age ancestors is fading, that the poet Hesiod steps forward. And he offers a completely different perspective, what the source calls the power of memory, or the dagger.
His poem, The 5 Ages of Mortal Men, it just completely flips the whole idea of progress on its head. It's a rejection of the rising power of the city-states. It's this beautiful anti-history. Let's walk through those ages again because the contrast is so important.
It's a roadmap of decline. It starts with the golden race. This is the ideal. These are pastoral nomads living, and I'm quoting, like gods without sorrow of heart, remote and free from toil and grief, rich in flocks. This is the memory of a free, non-extractive, non-militarized life.
Yeah, then we get the Silver Generation. A step down, disoriented, punished by Zeus for not honoring the gods, a kind of early confusion.
After them comes the brazen race, the violent, strong warrior federations we just discussed, who were ultimately destroyed by their own self-consuming violence. They were terrible, but there was a kind of purity to their rejection of commerce.
Followed by the brief, tragic interlude of the hero men or demigods, the figures from Homer's epics, the war chiefs at Thebes and Troy, a short, noble transitional era.
And that brings us to the fifth and final age, the Iron Race. Hesiod's own time, the victims and the accomplices of the wine and olive merchants. The Greeks who have been fully initiated into civilization, into conformity, by their Phoenician teachers.
In his description of this age, his lament is maybe the clearest summary of the moral decay that the source has been tracking this whole time. He is in absolute despair.
Total generational despair. I mean, Hesiod's words are a direct assault on the idea that commerce and cities are progress. He writes, "Would that I were not among the men of the fifth generation, but either had died before or been born afterwards." He is actively wishing he didn't exist in his own time.
Why is the Iron Age so much worse for him than, say, the Brazen Age, which was just pure violence?
Because the Brazen Age, for all its violence, was maybe honest. The Iron Age is defined by relentless, systemic suffering and injustice. He says men never rest from labor by day and from perishing by night. Their whole survival is now tied to inescapable toil, that curse of labor we saw with the Israelites. And beyond that, the very moral structure of society has been inverted. Might shall be their right, and one man will sack another city.
The system has no moral justification left. It's just power.
And he says there will be no favor for the man who keeps his oath, or for the just, or for the good, but rather men will praise the evildoer and his violent dealing. This is the inversion. When extraction becomes the main goal of your society, goodness becomes a liability, and violence is praised as long as it serves the Leviathan.
And this leads to the ultimate spiritual collapse, the departure of Eidos and Nemesis.
It's the final consequence. The source quotes Hesiod, saying eidos, shame, and nemesis, righteous indignation, with their sweet forms wrapped in white robes, will go from the wide-pathed earth and forsake mankind to join the company of deathless gods. When those two moral forces leave the world, society loses its ability to police itself or even to feel outrage at its own injustice. The descent is total.
So conceptually, what is this power that Hesiod is offering? He's trapped in this unjust commercial reality, but he's using the memory of a pastoral ideal to critique it.
That power is the ability to critique the system you're in from the inside by using the memory of something better, something external, as your leverage. The source says Hesiod had the power to remove his Leviathanic mask while still enmeshed in a Leviathanic web. We have a modern name for this power. We call it critical theory.
The ability to see the artificial, self-serving nature of the state you live in.
Exactly. And this brings us to the final and most profound irony in the entire source material. Hesiod gives his fellow Greeks this incredibly powerful tool, this critical dagger with two edges. They have the memory of a golden age, and they have the language to condemn the Iron Age. So, did they use it?
They didn't shape it, they turned their backs on it. The source says that at the exact moment Hesiod was delivering this searing critique, his countrymen were too busy.
Too busy learning the Phoenician alphabet and preparing to hurl themselves into an octopus of their own, they chose the immediate material rewards of imitation. They wanted to set up their own commercial cities, secure their own wealth. And they chose that over the radical, difficult demand for justice and originality that their own poet was articulating.
They chose the comfort and conformity of the Iron Age over the intellectual and moral hardship required to actually use the dagger.
A tragedy that, you could argue, has been repeated over and over again throughout history. The comfort of the prison is so often preferred to the difficulty of true freedom. Hashtag tag outrack outro.
So, what does this all mean? Where does this deep dive leave us? We've traced this incredibly powerful philosophical argument through three major ancient stories, and the choice seems to be presented over and over again. Do you endure the hardship that it takes to create and sustain an original, meaningful community? Or do you take the easy route, the well-trodden path of military and commercial imitation?
In that path of imitation, whether it's Israel copying Assyria or Greece copying Phoenicia, it seems to always lead to one of two dead ends. Either the artificial state rots from the inside, like the Hittite worm did, when its own people just withdraw their energy and their belief.
Or it gets eaten.
Or it gets violently consumed by a bigger, more efficient imitator,
Yeah.
which was what happened to Israel at the hands of Assyria.
And that master analogy remains right at the center of it all. The King of Kings is just a corporate logo for the state machine. The Leviathan is an artificial thing. It runs entirely on human belief and human compliance. And when you withdraw that human input, the machine just fails, no matter how strong its walls are.
And yet, the ultimate unanswered question still hangs over everything. Why is conformity so powerful?
Yeah.
The Israelites were given this unique, abstract God that demanded originality. The Greeks had a living cultural memory of a golden age and the philosophical tools of critical theory. So why did both of them find it so much easier to just adopt the stories, the laws, the rapacious commercial models of the very societies they were supposed to be transcending? Why is imitation always the path of least resistance?
The sheer difficulty of being truly original when you compare it to the immediate material rewards of just fitting in, that seems to be the enduring human problem that just echoes down through history.
Which brings us to our final, provocative thought for you to take away. Hesiod gave the Greeks a powerful conceptual tool, this critical theory, this dagger with two edges. The source is very clear that the Greeks did not shape this dagger. They left it on the table. So if the memory of genuine freedom, of a golden age, still exists somewhere inside us, and the means to critique the Iron Age also exists, the ability to see the artificial, unjust nature of our own Leviathans, what was it that prevented them from using that dagger? And maybe a more uncomfortable question for us, what prevents us from picking it up and using it today?
Something to mull over until the next time we dive in.